Okay. Hello, everybody out there. It's great to be with you this evening. And it's particularly wonderful. Welcome to the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. My name is John Lustria. I'm the education coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And I was about to say it's wonderful to be doing this in the evening, and it's still light outside. You can see me. That's because there's natural light coming through my window. Back when we first started doing these at the beginning of the season, I had to have lamps and things on. So just I'm reflecting as I came up here to do this, how wonderful it is for it to be light outside. So anyway, all that aside, thank you for tuning in and joining us tonight. We have yet another exciting program in store for you. It's going to be a good one. So again, you're watching this on the National Museum of Civil War Medicine's YouTube channel. If you like things that the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable does or that we do, please consider subscribing to the museum. That helps. That makes sure you get a notification anytime we go live or post a video. If you like this video or other roundtable videos, which you can find on the museum's YouTube channel, go ahead and like this video, share it, subscribe, all that good stuff. It helps us out, it helps the roundtable out, it helps more people see programming like this. It's all free to do, and it's all something that is really, really helpful for us all. And if you want to take it to the next level, consider becoming a member either of the Roundtable or the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. For at least at the museum, as low as $25 a year. And you can find information on that on our website, civilwarmed.org. And I should note, if you have any questions today during the presentation, go ahead and leave them in the comments section, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. And I think we've had some pretty good discussions over the last year or so as we've done these. So do leave your questions in the comments. We'll get to them. And with all that said, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Matt.
Thank you, John. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Borders. I'm the president of the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. And I just want to echo what John said in regarding the programming that's going on and the joint partnership that we really have with the museum. Particularly this past year, our programs would not have been possible at the quality that they have been without our partnership with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And I just want to thank John for facilitating these programs over this whole season for us. It's greatly appreciated. And of course, the museum itself for all the work they've done with us to make sure that we can keep these talks going. Now, in the coming season, we are hoping to be back physically at the museum, but as we have all learned, we'll be playing that by ear. And we will be keeping you posted on that as well. I'll talk a little bit at the very end about some of our intentions for the summer and keeping you all informed. But I want to jump right into it this evening because, again, we do have a fantastic speaker for you. One of John's colleagues, actually, there at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We have Kyle Dalton. He is the Membership and Development Coordinator for the museum, and he is a fantastic researcher in and of himself. He is going to be speaking to us tonight about evacuation and the ambulance corps for Civil War armies. And so I want to turn it over now to our speaker this evening, Kyle Dalton. Kyle, again, thank you very much for joining us here with the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable, and please take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here. Glad to be able to broadcast from my new house. That's why there's all this stuff in the background that hasn't been unpacked. It's also why I've got this weird lighting situation. My neighbor's letting me use his internet for this. You also might see some wobbling because I'm on a card table. So this is all very impromptu. And I'm sorry if it looks a little weird on my screen or you hear some weird noises. But I think we'll have a lot of fun tonight. As Matt said, we're going to be talking about medical evacuation in the Civil War. Specifically, we'll be talking about the Ambulance Corps and the Infirmary Corps. Those are two different institutions. We're going to get into that, but I want to lay the groundwork first. Of course, we're focusing on the Civil War, but in order to understand why these organizations were important, how they existed, and how they changed, we got to have some background. prior to 1861, the last major conventional conflict on American soil was the War of 1812. It's been almost 50 years since the last major conventional conflict. And it was such a different conflict. In the War of 1812, less than 1/2% of all enlisted men became casualties. It was definitely a rarity to be wounded in combat. By the Battle of Gettysburg, 3% of the Army of the Potomac was devoted to just removing the dead and wounded. That's how much of a shift had occurred between the beginning of the 19th century and the Civil War. The Civil War was a conflict on industrial scale. Battles could last for days. Sieges could last for weeks or months. Someone had to deal with the wounded as that was going on and in its wake. Amazon.com has over 20,000 books on the Civil War. Being members of the Civil War Roundtable or following our content, you know that there's books out there about everything. There's books about the Navy. There's books about the American Indian experience. There's books about the contraband camps and the health crises within the contraband camps. All of these are worthy topics. I'm not diminishing that. All I'm saying is it's interesting that we've covered so much ground in this very fruitful era of historical study, but there is still no book about medical evacuation. There is no book about the ambulances. There's no book about the men who drove those ambulances or carried those stretchers. It just has not been done. It's a weird blind spot in a very brief period, only 5 years, that has been so thoroughly covered for half a century and longer. And so what I'm doing today is I'm focusing on the people that made up the ambulance corps. There is some research on models of ambulances. I've done some research on like types of stretchers, but I feel like the most important thing is understanding these organizations through the eyes of the people who occupied them, the people who did this. I think it's important that we ground this as a first real effort to dig into this topic. So again, I'll be focusing on the people today. There we go. When the Civil War began, as many of you Civil War buffs probably know, it was mostly musicians who evacuated the wounded. There are records of musicians who do successfully carry the wounded, sometimes in very difficult circumstances, but there are just as many accounts of them failing in that duty. During the Battle of the Wilderness, for one example, Herbert George, who's a musician in the 10th Vermont, received orders with the rest of his band to report to the rear as stretcher bearers and nurses. While he and his fellow musicians, including some of his brothers, were making their way to the hospital, they saw, in his words, the other bands fell out and remained side the road, somewhere in the rear, so that we are the only band and the only nurses here. There are three main reasons that musicians made unreliable ambulance men: physical ability, lack of motivation, and exposure to combat. The age of musicians was a pretty important factor in why they were sometimes incapable of medical evacuation. In 1864, Dr. Richard Vickery of the 2nd Michigan cautioned his fellow surgeons against relying on bandsmen. He said, "The drum corps and the regimental band, if there is one, are always on the eve of battle, ordered to report to the surgeon for duty. But the less he calculates on their aid, the better. With a few exceptions, they are generally worthless as stretcher bearers, many of them being young lads physically incapable of such fatiguing duty." The most widely used stretchers of the Civil War, the Satterley and other pattern that escapes my mind right now, they weighed between 23 and 26 pounds. The average Civil War soldier weighed 143 pounds. That means that the individual stretcher bearers, the two guys on the ends, were on average carrying 96 pounds apiece as they did their duty. And there are several accounts of these guys walking a mile back from combat to the field dressing station or field hospital, sometimes 2 miles. You had to carry nearly 100 pounds for a mile for just one evacuation. And this is, again, an era in which there were thousands of casualties after a single battle. So you had to be physically capable. And some of the musicians, undeniably, were not capable of doing that. Many musicians, even those who were physically fit, who could do this, like the ones we see in this photo here, simply didn't want to do it. It wasn't what they signed up for. As Frank Freeman says in his book, Gangrene and Glory, Musicians proved poor at removing wounded because of the common clash of attitudes and training. The musicians expected to play. They trained to play better. They did not like to practice their instruments, only to remove wounded. And in the bitter world of combat, they liked even less to perform under fire, that very action whose training they had avoided. In 1862, hospital steward Spencer Bonsall of the 81st Pennsylvania wrote, "Our drums have been silent for a long time, and music of all kind is tabooed, much to the disgust of our band. It is their duty to bring the wounded as fast as possible on litters." More importantly, the frightful conditions of Civil War combat understandably unnerved these musicians. After the Battle of Antietam, drummer turned stretcher bearer Lucian Hubbard of the 14th Connecticut wrote home to his mother, if I could get home, I would not care about coming again. Not because I am sick of it, but I do not like the look of some of the wounds I have to see. You can't imagine anything about it. I see men wounded in the head, arms, hands, legs, and all over the body. One fellow had 5 balls in him and did not stop fighting until a shell hit him and knocked his leg clean off. This combination of inappropriate age, lack of motivation, and especially mortal danger in combat meant that musicians were notoriously unreliable through the conflict. Again, you did have some that succeeded, but you couldn't rely on that. You could not know that that was going to happen. For the Union, a more fruitful source of ambulance men, at least for the first year and a half of combat, were the Contrabands. From the onset of hostilities, enslaved people escaped from Confederate armies and civilian enslavers to northern lines. The government soon adopted the contraband policy, which I know many of you know, was diplomatically sidestepping the issue of slavery, acknowledging enslaved people as property, but claiming that the government was holding that property to prevent it from being used in the war effort. The formerly enslaved gathered around military institutions, around forts, around camps, and they provided all sorts of services: launderers, cooks, laborers, teamsters. By the thousands, they provided a really helpful buffer in the early years of the war to the Union Army, and really throughout the war. For the first 2 years of the conflict, there was a lot of debate in the Northern press about what to do with these contrabands. Several journalists and newspapers in the North suggested using contrabands for medical evacuation, employing them as stretchers and ambulance drivers. These suggestions often took a condescending, paternalistic tone, as was the case in the New York Herald in July 1862. The subalterns and men of the ambulance corps might be profitably selected amongst the able-bodied contrabands who are now living like drones at the expense of the country. A letter published in the Daily Evansville Journal and really in a few other newspapers, they often repeated each other, in December of 1862 echoed that sentiment. It is to be admitted that African loyalty in this war will avail us little if we have not the good sense and good feeling enough properly to govern the Negroes who may enter our lines. To render their aid available for both their sakes and our own, we must not support them in idleness. Doubtless they will be most efficient as laborers, as domestics in camp, as teamsters, or employed on entrenchments and fortifications, or in the ambulance corps. He leaves off with the ambulance corps. Many of the contrabands were already serving this capacity. While the press in the North was having this sort of push for employing these idle and lazy contrabands, they were already doing it. They were already running the ambulances. They were already carrying the stretchers. They were already doing these things that the Northern press was sort of pretending they weren't doing. Pictured here, for example, is Hosea Simmons. He was a contraband from Georgia who served as an undercook and stretcher bearer in the 45th Illinois. After emancipation, he was transferred to a USCT regiment, the 66th USCT, where he was commissioned as sergeant. Again, these fears of idleness were completely unfounded. Not only does Simmons demonstrate this, but you see it throughout the early years of the conflict. Surgeon James Oliver praised the behavior of an African-American ambulance driver that accompanied him in retrieving Union wounded in 1862. And this was despite harassment by Confederate soldiers who threatened to re-enslave that man. Private Herbert Beecher of the 1st Light Battery Connecticut Volunteers recalled how another unnamed driver escaped artillery fire with wounded in the back of his ambulance. Perhaps most telling is the account of Surgeon Franklin Dyer, who says, "I saw some fine-looking colored soldiers bring in a miserable wretch of a rebel on a stretcher, and I thought at the time that they were better men. They could have easily saved themselves the trouble by putting a bayonet through him, but they brought a good many in." So here we even see that this surgeon himself did not believe that he would be capable of delivering the treatment that the USCT stretcher bearers were doing. There's, of course, a lot of rancorous debate about his ethics, but that's sort of off to the side. What we're talking about are these men and the fact that they were capable of doing this duty. And this was pretty quickly recognized after emancipation and the official establishment of the USCT. By the time that the USCT was established, many of them were being phased, many of the contrabands were being phased out of ambulance duty. And that was because of the establishment of the Army of the Potomac's Ambulance Corps. This here, what you see, is a very rare photo. I've seen only maybe 4 photos of this that shows a man in U.S. Ambulance Corps uniform. It's incredibly rare. It's from our collection. And you can see he's got a broad green stripe along the arm, not unlike a hospital steward. He's also got a broad green stripe around the hat, which is very distinctive. He doesn't have any insignia inside the armband, as you would see on a hospital steward. This is the uniform that was created by Army of the Potomac's medical director, Dr. Jonathan Letterman. If you've been to our museum, you know about Dr. Letterman. He's our patron saint. We're all about Dr. Letterman here. And a big reason that Dr. Letterman is still revered today is because of this organization. It was the first attempt in our nation's history to create a permanent, robust, and well-trained unit devoted solely to combat medical evacuation. Never before had this existed. Dr. Letterman directed that the Ambulance Corps be selected from the ranks of their own regiments, not be brought in from outside, and that they had to be proven to be, and this is key, active and efficient. This was key because commanders often saw the Ambulance Corps as an opportunity to rid themselves of undesirable soldiers. It was a way of getting rid of shirkers, potential deserters, people who were messing with discipline. And this is said explicitly at the time. Captain Elliot Pierce, who commanded a unit of Ambulance Corps, complained to his fellow officers that the Corps was viewed as an asylum for invalids, a home for cripples, a refugee for stragglers, bummers, and those who are constitutionally fatigued, particularly in cases of all action. This, of course, would do no good. If your Ambulance Corps is just not doing their job, then why bother having an Ambulance Corps? If it's going to be filled with people who are physically incapable, who are going to avoid combat, well, then you might as well stick with the musicians because you're getting the same thing. You're getting the same unreliability. So it was key that they be proven active and efficient. To prevent these abuses and ensure that the Ambulance Corps were made up of capable soldiers drawn from their own regiments, regimental officers who assigned them, because it was the officers themselves who sent them off, they were subject to review. Dr. Thomas McParland, Letterman's successor as medical director, wrote in 1864, as was to be expected, a large portion of those first detailed were rejected, regimental commanders having attempted to rid themselves of their weak and worthless men. There were halting attempts in the Confederacy to do something similar, but none of them really took off. In the South, the more common term for Ambulance Corps was Infirmary Corps. What we see here is a hat badge. It's a Confederate hat badge. There's a few of these that still exist. We have one. This is from our collection. There's another at the National Museum of the American Civil War in Richmond. You'll see them pop up on auction sites every now and then. Sometimes they're fake, sometimes they're authentic. But what's really key about these is that they were reusable. In that last image we saw, the uniform was permanent. He had his portrait taken in the uniform. It was stitched onto the uniform. You couldn't get rid of it. These hat badges were meant to be given out right before combat and returned right afterward. And what that's reflective of is the temporary assignment. These guys were not intended to stay ambulance corpsmen. That was not their only job. They were soldiers first. They had guns first. And then if there was time, if you could get them away from the line, or if they were no good at that, then you'd move them to the ambulance corps, or what they called the Infirmary Corps. The Confederacy, again, had some halting attempts to create a more robust and permanent system, but none of them really got off the ground. Surgeon Chisholm says in his Manual of Military Surgery that the ambulance corps, as connected with the brigade in Confederate service, is composed of 2 men from each company of 100 men, selected for bravery, strength, endurance, and good character, the object being to make this corps as efficient as possible. Now, he says that, he puts it in his manual, but it's never in the orders. There is no order that is quite this stringent. You have some things that are kind of adjacent to that, but they never really fully commit to it. There's no barrier to regimental officers sending cast-offs. There's no barrier to drawing those guys back as soon as the battle is over. And there's no requirement of training, and that's really important. They were also habitually undersupplied. Private A.C. McCleary of the 12th Tennessee, for example, was assigned to the Infirmary Corps just a couple of hours before a battle. He later recalled, "We had no litters on which to carry the dead and wounded, so we often had a hard time taking them off the field to where the ambulances could get to them." And that's assuming there were ambulances to get to them. There was, unfortunately, a huge disparity in ambulance production and maintenance between the North and the South. The North typically had about 1 ambulance for every 100 men, and that number changes throughout the conflict. You're more likely to get that later in the war than the beginning. In some Southern armies, there was 1 ambulance for every 1,000 men. That's simply not enough. When you're looking at some of these huge battles, they're completely overwhelmed, and they're often leaving men on the field. In Richmond, there was a somewhat more successful attempt to create a more robust infirmary corps. This advertisement here is a recruiting advertisement that was put out by Captain Thomas Herbig. I think I pronounced that right. He was a German immigrant. It was initially composed mostly of German immigrants in Richmond. And he tried to put together a small company that would be dedicated to medical evacuation. He never really fully got what he was going for. They were plagued by desertion. Here you can see he uses the same space for recruiting that he does for trying to get deserters to come back. Desertion plagued this company for the first year or so of its existence, and it was never full strength. Also importantly, in some of these advertisements, he starts to lower his standards. In one, for example, he calls for barbers, cuppers, and leechers, all of which were rejected by the medical establishment in the era. Less than a year after organizing this corps, Captain Herbig resigned in frustration. He was so sick of trying to deal with all this, he just gave up and he went home. His Infirmary Corps did continue to serve throughout the war. In fact, there were still a few of them that surrendered at Appomattox. But again, it never really got as robust as he was hoping. Another attempt was launched by the citizens of Richmond with some success, the Richmond Ambulance Committee. You may have heard of this as the Ambulance Committee or the Committee for the Care of Our Wounded. It was more robust. It was a lot bigger. They were really good at collecting medical supplies, but they were never allowed at the front. They were never allowed into active combat zones. So really, they were closer to like the Sanitary Commission or the Christian Commission. They were very good at what they did, but they were only evacuating people after they'd gotten back to the hospitals. They were not combat medical evacuation. The failure of the Confederacy to establish anything like Letterman's Ambulance Corps was partly from a lack of resources, partly from strained infrastructure, but more important than any of that was just a lack of willingness by Confederate authorities to commit to the idea. Twice, representatives in the Confederate Congress proposed acts that would mandate a trained infirmary corps, sometimes modeled off of, or at least it seems to be modeled off of, the Manual of Military Surgery, Chisholm's suggestions of 2 men for every 100. One bill was even passed through the Confederate Congress, but it was vetoed by Jefferson Davis as being ill-conceived. And to be fair, it was pretty ill-conceived. The other that was introduced a short time later was struck from the bill before it was passed. So there was no national effort, no successful national effort to create a robust infirmary corps the way that the North had. The reason for Confederate reluctance was perhaps best laid out by General P.G.T. Beauregard. Every year of the conflict, Beauregard would issue the same set of orders of how to prepare for battle. And they evolve as the war goes along, from before his first battle at Bull Run all the way to the end of the war in 1865. He's always adding on to these orders, removing things. It's really interesting to see his evolution, his change in thought. But every single one of those orders that only the least effective under arms be assigned to the Infirmary Corps. Every single year, all the way through the end of the conflict, P.G. Beauregard keeps saying only the least efficient men under arms. He's saying the exact opposite of what the North is saying. The North is saying we need efficient men. He's saying, no, this is a great way we deal with cast-offs. He justified this order every time by writing, the surest way to protect our wounded is to drive the enemy from the field. The most pressing, highest duty is to win the victory. With limited resources, the Confederacy prioritized tactical needs over immediate evacuation. As you might expect, the lack of supplies, the absence of a dedicated trained infirmary corps, these both contributed to higher mortality rates for Confederate soldiers compared to their Union enemies. But there was an area in which the Confederacy outstripped the United States in its approach to medical evacuation: first aid. In rare cases where there was a dedicated trained infirmary corps, even if its numbers were slight, they were much more likely to be trained in first aid. Captain Herbig insisted that his men be supplied with bandages. Beauregard, revising his orders again as the years went on, as the war went on, never stopped insisting on employing the least effective underarms, but he did later command that they be trained in bandaging wounds. Individual commanders throughout Confederate forces took it upon themselves to supply and train their ambulance men to treat wounds immediately. U.S. forces, by contrast, never ordered their ambulances to carry bandages or medical supplies. You can go and see what was dictated to be in. There's water, there's food, there's lanterns, no bandages, no medicine. That was never dictated to be carried by Union ambulances. I have yet to find that any of the stretcher bearers were trained in bandaging, much less supplied with them. It seems strange to me that you wouldn't give them bandages, that you wouldn't give them tourniquets. And perhaps there were cases of them doing it of their own accord, but they're not being enabled by the military leadership to do so. And there are some accounts written by the stretcher bearers themselves about their frustration of carrying somebody a mile, 2 miles, just to have him die as soon as they set him down, presumably from bleeding out. These men were not being equipped for success in the same way that, again, very few, but some infirmary corps men were. So again, Confederate wounded were far less likely to be picked up by their own men. They were far less likely to actually get that evacuation. But if they were evacuated, they were more likely to receive first aid. Regardless of one's allegiance, Civil War combat produced unimaginable casualties that the meager resources of neither army could really handle at the outset. Battles lasted for days, sieges lasted for weeks or months, as I said earlier, and timely evacuation increased survivability. This is something they knew at the time. In his Manual of Military Surgery, Chisholm, who I mentioned earlier, wrote, "The experience of every battlefield shows that the mortality following the amputation of limbs, which require immediate operation, is always less than those performed some days after the infliction of the wound." This was a lesson that had been learned from recent history. Union surgeon Samuel DeGrosse, in his own Manual of Military Surgery, wrote, "The results of military surgery in the Crimea show that the success of amputations was very fair when performed early, but most unfortunate when they were put off for any length of time. This was the case, it would seem, both in the English and French armies." Given the importance of prompt evacuation and the fact they recognized that, ambulance men were required to enter active battlefields while they're still happening, while they're still fighting, even for the wounded not in the most immediate danger. They could not wait until the fighting stopped. That is a very important thing to understand when examining the evacuation efforts of the Civil War. Predictably, this did lead to some high casualties for the ambulance men. Artillery proved to be the most significant threat to the ambulances themselves. Operating immediately behind the infantry, sometimes beyond the reach of musket fire, ambulances and stretchers ran back and forth along the same routes that were used for rations and ammunition and troop movements. There was no consistent form of identification for ambulances. This is before the Red Cross. quartermasters of both sides, at least in the beginning of the war, could requisition ambulances to move war materiel, making them legitimate military targets. Private John D. Folsom of the 11th New Hampshire remembered a large shell or large fragment passed between us as we were carrying the stretcher and struck the low bushes beneath the road. Lieutenant Crossley of the 118th Pennsylvania wrote, a shell that came uncomfortably near my ambulance, and being so unexpected, it came near taking my breath away. Drummer Henry Kiefer, who was carrying an ambulance, also recalled a narrow escape. Andy calls me away for a moment to look at some poor fellow's arm who is off at the shoulder. And it was just in time I got away too, for immediately a shell plunges into the sod where I had been sitting, tearing my stretcher to tatters. Such anecdotes are very common among surviving accounts of the ambulance corps. Aside from unintentional crossfire, there is a tendency in popular history to dismiss the darker side of the Civil War. Occasional ceasefires, like the one we see here, did allow medical treatment and burial of the wounded. Intentionally targeting surgeons in combat was rare and was widely regarded as criminal by both sides. The notion of limited warfare does have some justification. So again, I'm not saying that we should say that war crimes were particularly common between white soldiers of the Civil War, but we also have to remember that the Civil War was America's most destructive conflict. Hundreds of thousands of deaths, cities laid to waste. We all seen the photos of Richmond as ruins. Years of violence on an unprecedented scale. They all present a powerful argument against strictly limited warfare. And this does bleed through into medical personnel. Stretcher bearers were intentionally targeted throughout the conflict. The respective medical professionals, the treatment of enemy wounded, that was conditional throughout the Civil War. And sometimes it didn't occur at all. The high casualty rates of the ambulance men and their ill-defined role as semi-combatants are strong evidence of this. There was no official binding agreement on the treatment of enlisted medical personnel. The first Geneva Convention wasn't held until 1864. The US was not a signatory, and as an unrecognized state, the Confederacy wouldn't have been eligible to sign anyway. The Winchester Accords, that agreement between Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac, is rightfully touted as a major step towards protection for non-combatants, but it didn't include ambulance men. Ambulance men on both sides were often combatants that were assigned to that duty temporarily. You remember that hat badge for the Confederacy? These were men who were soldiers first, medical men second, oftentimes. While not currently under arms, ambulance men might well be soldiers trained in conflict. The failure to establish an official agreement on the protection of ambulance men in the performance of their duty, it had some serious consequences. Reliable accounts from among the reports, journals, letters, and memoirs of soldiers can be found. Confederate General Bushrod Johnson complained, "One of our men, yielding to natural sympathy, excited by the continued cries of suffering humanity, crawled to a wounded Federal, was endeavoring to place him in a comfortable position, and the enemy pickets shot the Good Samaritan, wounding him in the arm." Edward Carter of the 35th Massachusetts lamented that the enemy had a reputation of a willingness to thus murder unarmed and wounded men, as well as those in open conflict, by targeting ambulances with artillery. During guerrilla warfare in Alabama, an wounded General McCook, Union General McCook, was shot through his intestines, mortally wounded, potentially in the ambulance that he was being carried in. Sharpshooters were especially likely to target stretcher bearers. Dr. Francis Wafer of the 108th New York recalled attempts by his ambulance men to evacuate wounded rebels from between the lines. On our men attempting to remove these during the day, they were deliberately fired at by enemy sharpshooters. Private Robert Hale Strong recalled a fight during the Chattanooga campaign when some rebel sharpshooter wounded a soldier, and when the stretcher bearers come and got him and started to the rear, both stretcher bearers were shot and killed, the hind one falling onto the wounded man. Now, it's important to note that there's always a tone of indignation when referring to enemy soldiers who fired on ambulance men, but very few of these offenders were ever identified. There is a rare case, which I think is very telling, that's transcribed by Frank Moore in 1868. The officer, whose name was not transcribed, unfortunately, he's a Union officer, he reported that an infamous rebel assassin named C.H. Jones, Company C, 6th Florida, when Captain Towsley's ambulance corps were collecting the wounded from his hiding place, fired and wounded one of the stretcher bearers and immediately came out and surrendered himself. Tonight, great indignation is felt round our headquarters, where the murderer has been provided with quarters. Private Jones' case is important for us because it explores that weird area of them being semi-combatants. And how does that translate into military law? Are they legitimate targets or are they not? Despite the officer's clear disgust and his men's clear disgust with Private Jones's actions, the Confederate soldier was treated as a prisoner of war and not a war criminal. Records show no evidence of reprisals against Jones, either official or unofficial, for ambushing a stretcher bearer. Today, of course, that would be a pretty big deal, but at the time, he suffered no reprisals for that. In fact, the records in the National Archives indicate that Jones was exchanged and returned to the 6th Florida before the end of the war. They sent him back. Again, I don't mean to suggest that most casualties of the stretcher bearers were the result of intentional targeting, but it did happen, and more often than we give credit for. Through both collateral fire and intentional targeting, stretcher bearers and ambulance drivers suffered high casualty rates throughout the conflict. Captain W.F. Drum, Chief Ambulance Officer of the 5th Corps, saw these fatalities and wounds as a sign that the ambulance corps was operating properly. The large number of casualties which occurred among them is good evidence that the men of the ambulance corps did their duty well under fire. There were 27 casualties among ambulance men of his corps alone in one battle. Confederate Surgeon Chisholm, again, I've mentioned him a couple of times, used similar logic in praising the stretcher bearers of the Confederacy, who displayed undaunted courage as well as great endurance under fire, following closely the line of battle with their lives exposed at every moment from the missiles of the enemy, and yet unharmed and without excitement. In short, there's a preponderance of evidence that ambulance men were continually exposed to threats to their lives. This was a pretty severe strain, as you can imagine, that was amplified by the nature of their assignment. The horror of battle and its aftermath, even devoid of mortal danger, was traumatic inherently. Unable to reach a wounded man caught between the lines, ambulance driver William Leonard wrote that the poor fellow was in so much misery that he wanted someone to shoot him. Finding no one would do it, he put the muzzle of his rifle to his head and took a stick and pushed his gun and blew off his brains. Surgeon James Oliver remembered a similarly horrific experience. After dark, I took a load back to the rear over a terrible rough road. To this day, I can hear the awful groan of these poor wounded fellows as the ambulance shook them up. One poor fellow begged to be taken out and put beside the road, left to die. Stretcher bearer Hayward Emmel also was haunted by the sounds of the wounded, something he would remember for years to come. Some of the wounded were so badly wounded that they screamed awfully when we would try to get them into the ambulance. Much of this misery came from mishandling severely wounded soldiers. The danger of using soldiers untrained in evacuation was the likelihood of exacerbating wounds. Private Billings, who wrote Hardtack and Coffee, recalled using a blanket slung between muskets like we see here in this original sketch by Alfred Wad from the Library of Congress, The Battle of the Wilderness. The account that Billings gives us is from the Battle of Hatcher's Run. He says, the wounded officer was heavy, and it was, as can be clearly seen, an awkward way of carrying him. Moreover, his wound was a serious one, mortal as it soon proved, and every movement of ours tortured him so that he begged us to leave him there to die. When Stonewall Jackson was famously wounded at Chancellorsville, his stretcher bearers dropped him twice. The bearers enabled a fall of 5 feet when they came under artillery fire by carrying him wrong. They carried him too high. Union stretcher bearers, when they were trained, when they were in the ambulance corps, would often try to carry as low as possible. So if they tripped or fell or dropped, that you wouldn't fall that far. Unfortunately, these Confederate stretcher bearers were really holding him up high. A short time later, one of the bearers tripped and Jackson fell again, and this time onto his wounded arm. According to Jackson biographer James I. Robertson Jr., one or both of these accidents tore the artery in the left arm and triggered heavy bleeding. Wounded in the abdomen, Lieutenant Bowditch, grandson of the famous Nathaniel Bowditch of the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry, was helped into the saddle by a well-meaning trooper. But because he was wounded in the abdomen, that was the worst possible way to carry him. It aggravated his already mortal wound. Dr. Letterman's ambulance corps was the first attempt at implementing a rigorous and thorough training regimen that would mitigate the suffering as much as possible. A correspondent in the British Medical and Surgical Times and Gazette reported that for some 2 or 3 weeks previous to the Battle of Fredericksburg, the ambulance corps of the Army, lately reorganized and considerably augmented, was daily drilled under the superintendence of the medical officers, so that during and after the battle, the care and expedition with which it performed its duties rendered its service of infinite value. Similarly, an American journalist, the New York Times, in an article about the ambulance corps said, "The drilling practice of the men are, of course, conducted with a view of the efficiency of their own department." Now, how exactly this drill worked is not well documented, unfortunately. We see all these comments of them getting drilled and trained, but not even describe what exactly they were doing. There are some vestiges that survive in archival sources, though. Dr. Letterman ordered the captains of his ambulance corps will institute a drill in this corps, instructing his men in the most easy and expeditious method of putting men in and taking them out of the ambulances. Taking men from the ground, placing and carrying them on a stretcher, observing that the front man steps off with his left foot and the rear man with his right, etc. Presumably, he knew that his subordinates would know what the etc. meant, but unfortunately for us, that's all we've got. This may have been inspired by Dr. Woodward's Hospital Steward's Manual, very useful guide. It was published the same year as Letterman's orders, and in that, he gave very specific instructions on the carrying of wounded by stretcher. The stretcher should be carried by 2 strong attendants, who shall be directed to step off in such a manner that when the foremost puts his right foot foremost, the hindmost shall put forward his left. By doing so, much unnecessary jolting and tilting of the stretcher will be avoided. If stairs are to be ascended, the foremost bearer should lower his end of the stretcher, while the hindmost elevates, so in such a manner as to keep the patient nearly on a level as possible. The reverse is to be done if the stairs are descended. Ambulance drivers were also subject to repetitive training. Lieutenant Thomas Livermore, ambulance officer of the 5th New Hampshire, remembered, "I drilled my ambulance divisions in moving in line, wheeling in sections of 4, coming into line in columns, and other maneuvers calculated in my estimation to make the long train more wieldy. As I had buglers, and the train in column was nearly half a mile long, it was a really fine sight to see the drivers execute these evolutions with precision at the signal from the bugles." Training is useful in dealing with combat stress, but there was no such thing as conditioning in the 1860s, meaning these men were not trained in how to deal with the psychological stress they were being subjected to. Exposure to combat stress over time inured ambulance men to trauma they experienced. Private Leonard, the ambulance driver I mentioned earlier, made the connection between exposure to combat and the ability to do his job explicit. He said, "The longer a man is under fire, the less he dreads it. I don't dread it half as bad as I did back in the wilderness. You let a regiment of old soldiers go into a fight and they won't lose half the men a raw regiment will in the same place. Raw recruits don't understand it. It is just like learning a trade." Often this trade created emotional calluses among the ambulance men. Private John Folsom, stretcher bearer who I mentioned earlier, remembered, "One man died after we carried him a mile, and just as we set him down at the field hospital. As I remember, we were highly incensed at his dying at that inopportune moment. War had pretty much blunted the fine edge of our sensibilities." General Henry Thomas recalled these emotional calluses among the ambulance corps of a USCT regiment. "While the contemplation of one death so softens the heart, the sight of myriad dead on a battlefield blunts the sensibilities." Notice how close that is to what the stretcher bearer had said earlier. "During the burial of the dead, I saw a striking incidence of this. A stretcher bearer, seeing that the trouser pocket of a soldier long dead contained part of a plug of tobacco, deliberately cut it out and taking a chew with an air of relish, transferred the rest to his own pocket. George Allen of the 4th Rhode Island witnessed a similar scene in which 2 stretcher bearers sat smoking by a shallow open grave, waiting for their mortally wounded comrade to die. They betrayed not the least sense of emotion or feeling for the poor wretch. Such scenes were common, and yet all this lack of sympathy was without malice, and but the result of living night and day within the valley of the shadow of death. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, musicians, volunteers, soldiers assigned to the duty without formal training continued to be employed throughout the end of the war. The Ambulance Corps was the exception rather than the rule. Speaking on behalf of all of his fellow infantrymen in the Union Army, Private Billings wrote, "One regulation made for this department of the service was never enforced. It provided that no one but the Ambulance Corps should conduct sick or wounded to the rear. But as a matter of fact, there were probably more wounded men helped off the field by soldiers not members of the Ambulance Corps than by members of that body." It was simply impossible for the U.S. Ambulance Corps to keep up. It was nationalized in 1864 through the United States Ambulance Corps Act. All armies and all commands were required to have a sizable part of their army be Ambulance Corps. But again, it was just simply overwhelming. There was no way for these armies to keep up. Private Daniel Brown, an ambulance driver of the 2nd Massachusetts, wrote in his journal during the Battle of Gettysburg that he was evacuating wounded from 4 p.m. to 2 a.m. on July 2nd. He got less than 3 hours of sleep and then continued evacuating wounded for an additional 14 hours on the 3rd. Such anecdotes are very common in accounts of ambulance drivers and stretcher bearers, and attest to the scale of human wreckage left by the Civil War. The Ambulance Corps undoubtedly saved countless lives. Soldiers were far safer being evacuated by trained personnel than their untrained companions, but it was still better to be carried off an active battlefield by someone untrained than merely to be left behind to bleed death. In short, we can say that stretcher bearers and ambulance drivers were a diverse lot. There were volunteers, there were contrabands, there were untrained soldiers and musicians who made it the bulk of medical evacuation. Their challenges against a new kind of warfare necessitated a major shift in military medical policy and gave birth to an innovative system in the North from which we still benefit from today. A trained body of men with the ability to handle the stress of an active Civil War battlefield and safely evacuate the wounded. And the line between the ways we benefit from that innovation are very strong. The very first civilian ambulances were founded in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. The very first was at Good Samaritan Hospital in Cincinnati. The second was at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. Both of those ambulance teams still run today. The Good Samaritan Hospital still runs today, and the Bellevue Hospital one is now FDNY EMS Station number 8. So both of these organizations, the very first civilian ambulances, come from this era, from the people we see in these photographs. It's a very straight line in how we benefit from an innovation of the period. There is, of course, much more to say about this subject, but I'm sure that we've got some questions. I've been yammering on for quite some time now, and I hope that you enjoyed this. I'm happy to field any questions you might have.
Fantastic, Kyle. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. I know I've got a question or two there, John, but we'll let the viewing public ask first.
We've got a few questions here. One from Barbara Schultz, one of our members and longtime.
Barbara.
Members, longtime viewers. She asks, did the Ambulance Corps make any decisions on their own not to pick up someone who was only minutes away from death? So to what extent did they participate in the triage system?
Unfortunately, we don't have good sources for that. I would be surprised if they didn't, but there was no formal system for it. And given the trauma that they had been through, that comes through pretty clearly in some of those accounts that I read, if they made those kind of moral gray area decisions, they probably weren't going to write it down. They probably weren't going to be sharing that with people. It would be very surprising to me if they didn't make those choices. But again, I can't say. We don't have the sources for that, unfortunately. What I can say is there is definitely a triage of allegiance. We have a blog post about this on our website. But the short version of it is that both sides would always evacuate their own wounded, regardless of condition, before they evacuated the wounded enemy. That was universally applied throughout the war. So that exists. But as far as like actual medical triage on the field, deciding who to pick up first or last, we have no sources for that. There's no formal training for it, and nobody really wrote about it. So I'm afraid we don't have much.
And then another question from Barbara talking about the contrabands. Do you know what their compensation was, especially prior to emancipation? Were they paid, I mean, not in terms of like the exact amount of money they would make, but like, were they paid a salary? Was it more in-kind stuff, as in like, food and, lodging and protection and things like that? Do you know anything about that, Kyle?
Broad strokes, they were paid, but there's a lot of variables in that. So for example, Hosea Simmons, whose picture I showed earlier, who was an undercook in the 45th Illinois, he was undercook first. That was his salary. Part of his duties were being a stretcher bearer, and he could volunteer to be a stretcher bearer within that, but he was receiving the pay of an undercook for doing that. So he was salaried, but not to be a medical evacuation guy. As the war went on, as those contrabands became USCT soldiers, they received the regular pay of their rank, private, corporal, or sergeant. Yeah, there's a lot of wiggle room within that. It's unclear to me precisely how the large body of Teamsters was compensated. All I know is that they were. I don't really know how much or how that was structured.
Gotcha. And then the final question from the comments at this time, it's definitely sort of an off-the-wall question, but it's one that I'm sort of weirdly fascinated by, so I definitely want to make sure it gets brought up.
You got me intrigued now.
Sentinel asks, did soldiers have any ear protection? I've been to a few firing demonstrations, and they're fairly loud, and I always just have to wonder, I mean, it's a miracle that literally everyone who served in the Civil War wasn't deaf. So can you speak to that at all, Kyle? I know it's not quite.
No idea. That's a great question, but I don't know. Matt, do you know if they ever employed ear protection?
As far as I know, they did not have any formal ear protection. It would not surprise me if guys were putting something in their ears, be it a little plug of cotton or something like that, but no formal ear protection that I'm aware of. However, speaking to that issue of deafness, as you guys know, a lot of those pension records after the war are talking about a loss of hearing, both in the artillery and the infantry, because as was stated, these are loud events.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a continuous thing too. It's not just one big boom and then that's the battle.
Yeah, it's something I find fairly fascinating, how that either did or did not happen. So great question. Sorry we couldn't speak to it a little more clearly.
We'll have to do a blog post about that. We'll have to dig in.
There you go.
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that I find very interesting. Anyway, that's all the questions from the comment section at this time. And Matt, you mentioned you had one.
Yeah, Kyle, you had touched on it a little bit with your presentation, and you mentioned the stretchers themselves and the ambulances to a lesser extent actually getting better as the war progresses. That makes a lot of sense. We actually saw that in some of your images. That very technical one you had there in one of your last images, for example, versus the carrying them on a blanket or something. Yeah, there you go. But I'm curious about this aspect of the Confederate Ambulance Corps. I wasn't aware that they had been trained in rudimentary first aid. Do we see a development in what they're carrying as the war progresses? Now, obviously, that's going beyond the lack of supplies and things like that for the Confederacy, but do we see more adapted bandages other than just, okay, here's a bandage I can wrap around? Do you have something like a pressure pad like we see more nowadays, that sort of thing?
Well, that's an interesting thing in the medical history of the Confederacy, is that they clearly prioritize some things over others in the way that, like, the Union is prioritizing evacuation over first aid. The Confederacy does not prioritize ambulances, not just in not supplying them with a lot of people, making no national effort, they also just don't produce that many stretchers. They don't produce that many ambulances. The North, there's tons of patents for different kinds of ambulances. Here we see a two-wheeled model. That's actually a development of a later sort, even though two-wheeled models have been mostly abandoned by this point in the war. There's many four-wheeled models. The stretcher model that we see here, we've actually got a great example in our museum, an original of these. Shoot, it escapes my mind. But you see, it's like this really complex thing. Confederacy has nothing like that. They just never get even close to that. They're not producing these things. It's not a priority for them. And yeah, lack of resources plays into that. But what's interesting is comparing this to, say, Confederate anesthesia. They really prioritize anesthesia. There's factories all over the South for local production. They're paying top dollar for whatever comes through the blockade. You see no similar effort to produce ambulances and stretchers in the way that they're producing anesthesia. Virtually every Confederate soldier goes under anesthesia through the war. There's very few circumstances where they don't. And that's because they're making it a priority. It is a huge priority for them to get that. And they really pull out all the stops. When it comes to ambulances, it's not even an afterthought. They're just not doing it. If you were lucky, you were getting captured Union ambulances. And the Union was producing them in such numbers that the Confederacy could capture them here and there. And it wasn't really going to severely hurt the Union war effort. In fact, before the Civil War, they gave an ambulance as a gift to a Kiowa war chief in the West. They were able to produce these in huge numbers. Not only were they able to, they chose to. And you just don't see that in the Confederacy. It's kind of baffling to me that the leadership, political and military, just doesn't see this as that big of a deal. In a war that has so many unprecedented casualties, their emphasis is always like, keep the guys on the line, get all the least effective guys out of the way, put them in the ambulance corps. Their focus is very much on tactical and strategic military victory. And moving the wounded, that comes later.
That's an interesting point, Kyle, because I mean, capturing the ambulances was a big deal. That's one of the things that really gets into a bickering match between some of the Confederate high command following Second Bull Run. There's a whole swath of Union ambulance that get captured, and they get into a fight over whose command should actually receive those ambulances.
Yeah, because they're that vital. They're just not making them themselves.
Right. Piggybacking off this idea of the ambulances, is there any communication or coordination between the ambulance and evacuation corps with the military railroads?
Yes. Yeah, on both sides. That one you do see pretty clear cooperation, North and South. That's where the Richmond Ambulance Committee, the Confederate, as I said, they were kind of closer to the Sanitary Commission than they were to a combat medical evacuation unit, but they do a lot of work with the railroads. They're very much about getting those soldiers back to those general hospitals. If you wound up in a Richmond Ambulance Committee ambulance, you were golden. It was just getting there was the trick. The Union was, again, a little bit more uniform in actually getting people off the field, and they worked pretty closely with the railroads as well. They were separate military departments, which is interesting. The ambulance corps did not have any authority over the railroads, and the railroads had no authority over them. The cooperation was simply everybody trying to do their job. But they separated that medical transportation from evacuation. They considered those different things.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you for answering those, Kyle. John, did we have any more pop up?
No more came in. I'm awash in the kind of fascination about sort of the prioritization that the Confederacy placed on the various medical aspects, and I think Kyle spoke to this a little bit, but I want to underscore. I mean, it's not that there are no sources out there. Kyle's done a pretty tremendous job of mining some of the ones that are out there, but we have just frustratingly few things to more clear, because one would have to imagine that there was some reasoning behind this, but it's just again, I'm not going to try and say it's definitely not out there, but if it is, it's awfully hard to access.
It is. So I think it goes back to what Beauregard said, that the highest victory is the goal, that if you win the battle, well, then you can move people off, which is, again, kind of against the military medical knowledge of the time, which is, no, you got to get them going now. Like, you can't wait You can't hold off until the battle's over. If this battle goes for 3 days, everybody wounded on day 1 is dead. You've got to go now. And they just continually prioritize that. There's actually a great account by Confederate soldiers at Gettysburg. And this guy talks about on the first day of Gettysburg, he's charging the Union line, and a soldier next to him is shot and falls. And one of his comrades goes to pick him up, and he grabs that guy and says, "Hey, orders say we got to leave him behind. So let's keep going." It was that indoctrinated that even soldiers on the ground are preventing themselves from medical evacuation because strategy, tactics, victory comes first. And that's a thing that we actually still deal with today. I was talking with an Air Force surgeon about this during one of our battlefield walks in Antietam, and he said, sometimes you gotta make the call. Like, is it more important to get the wounded out of the way or to win this battle? And that's a thing that ethicists are still dealing with today.
Fascinating stuff. Well, that's it from the comments here, Matt. I'll turn it back over to you here.
Great. Well, I just wanted to let everyone know, first off, once again, thank you, Kyle, for coming on this evening. It was a fantastic program, wonderful research, and thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And we're hoping to have you back in the near future, maybe when we can all be together.
Not too long from now, I hope.
Hopefully. Again, John, thank you for all your help this season. This will be the last program for the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable until September. It is, again, this season would not have been possible to the success we had it without our partnership with the Medical Museum. So thank you very much, John, for all the help there. Finally, I just want to let everyone know, particularly our membership and those interested in becoming members, that we will be putting out a summer newsletter, probably sometime around midsummer, just to keep you updated on as to what's going on with the roundtable and gearing up for the next season. You, of course, will be seeing some emails regarding our speakers schedule, and I'll keep the Medical Museum informed on that as well. But beyond that, I hope everyone continues to stay safe and stay healthy. Have a wonderful summer. We're looking forward to the world slowly reopening again. I think we all are looking forward to that. And I look forward to seeing both my comrades here and all of you back at the Medical Museum, hopefully this coming fall.
Splendid. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Good night.